Hello, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you are joining us from across the world. We're indeed in testing times, and as a result, we have decided from Football Collective to host this online conference to support early career researchers. We're also glad to have Mr. Peter Drury, who is a prominent football broadcaster, with us to deliver a keynote session. So before we get started, here are some of the ground rules. So when you join the presentation, please remain muted. Please remain muted when the presentation is on. And please direct your question to the chair of the session via Zoom private chat, who will ask them to the presenters. You can leave and join the conference anytime in the day. However, you will be placed in the waiting room if you are trying to join midway through the conference when the presentation is on. We'll be only let in the conference between presentations, and you can join the Facebook live chat whenever you want. We will be having 3 breaks. One is between 9:45 a.m. to 9:55 a.m. after the keynote. One is between 12 p.m. and 12:55 p.m. for lunch, and one is between 4 p.m. and 4:25 p.m. for tea. During the break, you can either choose to remain in the meeting and network with other presenters and participants attending the conference, or leave the room to take a break. You can join back again once the conference starts. The session will be chaired by, for the keynote session will be chaired by Paddy Ho. The 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. sessions will be chaired by Christina Filippo. The 1 p.m. to 2:40 p.m. session will be chaired by Helen O'Brien. The 2:40 to 4 p.m. sessions will be chaired by Lee Edmondson, and the 4:30 to 6:10 p.m. sessions will be chaired by Eleanor Drywood. All the questions from the conference attendees on Zoom to the presenters should be directed to the respective session chairs via the private chat. And if you are attending via Facebook Live, please post it on the chat and it will be directed through to our chairs by the Facebook admin. For participants, please join the conference at least 20 minutes before the start of the presentation. And you can use PowerPoint, Prezi, and whatever tools you have to showcase your research. Apart from the keynote session, all the participants will be given 10 minutes to present their research, and the chair of the session will warn the participant at the end of 9 minutes via private chat. After the end of 10 minutes, if you will be given a maximum of another 30 seconds to wrap up your presentation, following which you will be put on mute. Thank you. I hope you all enjoy the day. I will now pass on to Paddy Ho, who is the chair for the keynote session, and he will take it on from here.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's brilliant to welcome Peter here today. As someone, I have 26 years in journalism, and Peter's been an ever-present in all that time, starting off in BBC Radio. And, unwittingly, Peter, you touch a lot of the bases that the Football Collective is beginning to eke out, as it were, both thinking about the media, but also, things around football governance, computer games, which most of the world knows you about, as an area of study that a lot of people are getting involved in. So we really thank you for coming here today and giving your thoughts and giving us the keynote. And I'll not say much more, but I will reserve the first question when you're finished. So whenever you're ready, Peter, thanks.
Well, thank you, Paddy. And actually, I think you're right to identify questions as a key time, because I've got 15 minutes ahead of me here where I can talk broadly about what I do and about the history of television in the UK. But mine is not research of the sort that many of the other participants will have lined up for you. And I'd be keen largely to answer any questions you have afterwards. First of all, I've got to say, perhaps on behalf of everyone who's listening in and participating now, thank you to you and to Dan and Sarthak and everyone who's had the energy and the foresight and the imagination to lead the Online Football Collective into this particularly nasty bump in humanity's road. These are dreadful times for so many people, but whilst we all accept and endorse the prioritization of health and humanity over everything else, we lean heavily too on those whose hope and creativity is already investing itself in a post-pandemic future. So what is life without some sort of aim and aspiration? Your generation, the cohort on the cusp of breakthrough into our competitive and hard-edged industry, is surely the most frustrated by the suspension of normal life. You're on the point of making your mark and you are stalled. And I dearly hope that when normality returns, you'll have the opportunity to unleash your pent-up creativity and ambition into the world. It's a great privilege for me to have been invited in the company of so much intelligence and potential to launch this day of ideas and expertise. In fact, it's a little daunting to speak to so many whose ambition is presumably to improve upon the industry of which I've been a part for 30 odd years. Moving the vast football industry into the middle years of the 21st century will, I trust, be your business, and the array of topics through which the speakers are going to take this conference over the next 8 or 9 hours suggests that you're not short of good ideas. I'd like to believe that my career has enough years left in it that I'll be able to help with and benefit from your creative energy. But for now, I am content to start your day by placing your work into the context of history. My business, as you say, is football media, in particular broadcast media, in particular these days television. So rather than a dry excursion through the history of televised football, which you can find very easily online anyway, I guess the best thing I can do is to tell the story as I've seen it through the prism of my own experience. I was born in 1967, a year late, the year after England won the World Cup. The 1966 final, still arguably the most dramatic World Cup final ever, remains, according to most sources, the most watched event in the history of British television. Between them, the BBC and ITV claimed a combined audience of 32.3 million. That is a figure most closely challenged, but not beaten, by Princess Diana's funeral in 1997. And it's a figure that reflects the dovetailing, even by then, more than 50 years ago, of A, football as the predominant mass interest sport in this country, B, yes, of course, England's progress in their home competition, but also C, television's place as an accepted and modern medium via which top-level sport, and especially football, had become a shared national experience available to almost everyone. Even before the Second World War, the brand new BBC television service had dabbled in broadcasting football. After the war, and especially once ITV arrived as a commercial competitor, sport developed into a battleground. 1964 brought the introduction of Match of the Day, an iconic brand which remains to this day. It was by no means the first programme of its type, but it has proved the most long-lasting and loved. Naturally, England's 66 success did wonders for the popularity of football. Soon the various ITV regions united around the Big Match title to rival Match of the Day. And as I grew up through the 1970s, I was one of millions who followed football, principally live on the radio, but also via those famous highlight shows on the television. Because there were only 2 channels in those days, the presenters and commentators became synonymous with the action in a way which actually they never really can now in a multi-channel era. Kenneth Wolstenholme had provided the soundtrack and some unforgettable lines on England's greatest day, and he continued for quite some time actually. Jimmy Hill, a notable former player, turned out to be a television visionary. Brian Moore, who had commentated for BBC Radio in the 1966 finals, was a much-loved and hugely credible early face and voice for ITV. David Coleman had been and continued to be a totemic sports broadcaster for the BBC. Barry Davis, another iconic voice across a huge range of sports, arrived at the BBC from ITV. And of course, John Motson, possibly the voice of English football, certainly in the pre-satellite years, grew to the point of massive familiarity. These were famous people, and for a young boy growing up with a fascination both for football and broadcasting, they were my stars. ITV and the BBC often went head-to-head. FA Cup finals back then were not just between the teams, but between the broadcasters. World Cups were also seen as the ultimate showcase of talent and style. Almost invariably through the years, the BBC, as the established national channel with its attached gravitas and position in society, and of course with its absence of commercial breaks, has achieved better viewing figures at World Cups. But ITV, very often the underdog, has been commercially compelled to be creative and, for better or worse, somehow different. And this has sometimes proved inspired, notably and famously in 1974 when Brian Moore chaired ITV's World Cup panel, including some of the great strong opinions of the game, Clough, Malcolm Allison and co. And it was compelling. And in fact, it was the trailblazer for the type of opinion-driven punditry we take for granted today. In those days, World Cups and Cup finals aside, live television football was scarce. The annual England-Scotland game was a big treat, and it was clear that the public appetite was for more. In 1983, ITV was the first to offer a live football match from the old First Division. The 2-year contract for a relatively small peppering of games, shared by the two major channels, cost what seems now a puny £5.2 million. By 1988, an exclusive 4-year contract with ITV had rocketed to £44 million. It was now clear that live football was of immense value to the television companies. For the BBC, it was a ratings certainty. Likewise for ITV, who were able to satisfy their commercial imperative. Perhaps belatedly also football, which had once been hugely suspicious of television, particularly its potential effect on attendances, was becoming aware of its own worth within the broadcasting sector, and it was all about to explode. England's melodramatic performance at World Cup 1990, Lineker's goals, Gazza's tears, and the pain of a heartbreaking semi-final defeat on penalties, that propelled the players to an even greater level of stardom and whetted further the national appetite for more of the game on TV. Within a couple of years, that appetite was satisfied, or at least partly so. Technology was, as always, advancing, and the advent of satellite television changed the landscape beyond recognition. Sky Sports, as we now know it, was a part of Rupert Murdoch's huge media empire, and seeking to make its mark, recognised how top-level football could work at the very core of its offering. Now, the politics and the machinations of all the negotiating are the stuff of legend. Whole studies, books, theses have been written on that alone. But to cut it all short, in 1992, the Premier League was born and Sky had the exclusive rights to show it. This was not without its controversy, chiefly because Sky required a subscription. Free-to-air top-flight football had been snatched away. Very few people were at the outset able to watch it. But in the opinion of football's deal brokers, the eye-watering amount of money which Sky was able to pay more than compensated for the initial loss of viewers. Furthermore, Sky showed a determination to innovate with its football coverage. They became cutting edge in terms of technology and match analysis. Their slogan was a whole new ball game, and they meant it. Football, of course, had been through a rough couple of decades. Hooliganism on the terraces, the Hillsborough disaster, Heysel, the Bradford fire. Its reputation was largely in the gutter. Its crowds had dipped, its stadia were outmoded and often grim. It needed rebranding and lifting, and Sky helped it to do that. Its wealth paid for a long overdue upgrade. Over time, the subscription model caught on. Fans began to deal with the notion of paying for the product. It seems odd to say now when we're also used to our monthly direct debit, but it was a new expense then. The effect on the industry was huge. Suddenly, for young aspirants like me in their early mid-20s, there were new windows of opportunity. Sky and their launch rivals BSB, who became merged partners, recruited some of the bright prospects from established television channels and from radio. And at the same sort of time, the BBC started to formulate plans for a new 24-hour news and sport radio station. Now, as a young reporter in BBC local radio, this was all very exciting for me. My next move was to the BBC network in Broadcasting House in London, where I was a founder member of 5 Live and where I had the opportunity to commentate at a national level. It was a great time then to be on national radio. Sky's control over the fixture list meant that there were more standalone games requiring, of course, more commentators, more opportunities. And at the same time, Sky's relatively low subscription base meant that many fans continued to rely on radio for their live football. For the first 15 years of the Premier League, up to 2007, Sky had a monopoly on the Premier League, whilst, of course, extending its rights portfolio much more widely within and outside of football. Except for 3 years with ITV, BBC continued as the highlights broadcaster via Match of the Day. The two principal channels each had spells as the purveyor of the FA Cup, and ITV put a lot of its eggs into the basket of UEFA's new flagship, the European Champions League, a rebranding of the old European Cup. Since then, to put it simply, Premier League football has been beyond the pocket of old-style free-to-air channels. Attempts to compete with Sky have more than once ended in financial catastrophe. ITV Digital's attempt to create a rival platform founded on what most considered an ill-judged and unrealistically expensive deal to televise the Football League. The collapse of that deal impoverished and genuinely endangered many clubs. In 2007, when Sky's Premier League monopoly was deemed unacceptable, Setanta bought a couple of packages, but they went bankrupt in 2009. ESPN took over as junior partner. And since 2013, BT Sport have been the other domestic Premier League broadcaster. BT, having the deep pockets of such a massive company, have proved to be the most durable of the companies attempting to keep pace with Sky, not only having made it now into a third three-year cycle of Premier League rights, but also having successfully and very expensively prized the Champions League and the Europa League away from terrestrial channels. The intensity of competition and the mushrooming of potential providers has been largely good for those of us within the industry. Personally, I moved from BBC Radio to ITV in 1998 and enjoyed 14 years of being, at first, the exclusive and then the sole terrestrial Champions League broadcaster. The FA Cup, World Cups, European Championships, and those 3 years as the terrestrial highlights partner of the Premier League. But the end of my time at ITV was, in a way, reflective of the wider picture. Rights were increasingly expensive and seeping away. The financial landscape had changed. Exclusive contracts for presenters, commentators, and the like were becoming scarcer. For me, necessity was the mother of invention, and I ventured from that relative security into a jungle of opportunities elsewhere. And my greatest good fortune in that context was the increasing globalization of the Premier League, which was setting it up its own production arm. Overseas right holders were becoming increasingly hungry for a piece of the English Premier League action. And whilst for some years there had been a world feed broadcast, at least of the bigger games, now came an opportunity to be out there commentating every weekend on a gripping product and to a huge audience. The 2012 Aguero goal for Manchester City did a magnificent sales job for the Premier League. And I was fortunate to be its overseas commentator that day. 8 years on, the overseas TV rights contribute almost as much as the domestic rights to the wealth of the Premier League. And of course, it cuts both ways. Not only is the rest of the world fascinated by the English, but the English obsession with football means that our television companies want even more from abroad. For many years, Sky did a brilliant job of showcasing Spain's La Liga. Much of BT's early years material has been from Germany and France and Italy. And whilst those two most prominent pay TV channels have let slip some of that overseas material, it is generally snapped up by new aspirant platforms. Meantime, TV sport continues to evolve. To some extent, the old model still exists. There remains, particularly on special occasions, collective viewing, the family together on the sofa staring at the box in the corner of the room. But increasingly, we are chasing the internet into a world of phones and tablets and endless individual choice, multiple screens. You decide which match you want to watch and when and how and from which angle. Amazon Prime has entered the mainstream marketplace as a Premier League's right holder. Its launch last December was hailed as a great success. And yet this wasn't really TV. This was streaming, a whole new phenomenon in live sport, which, as connectivity continues to improve worldwide, can only grow. Now, some say television football has reached saturation point, and perhaps they're right. But amongst much else we have learned about ourselves during this pandemic, we've found how much we miss it when it's not there. Thousands extraordinarily tuned into the BBC's live stream of a Korean K-League game when it returned to action last week. The excitement at the promised return of the Bundesliga this weekend has been evident, and the tantalising prospect of a summer full of Premier League action, government regulations permitting, has us all licking our lips. Football on TV has become a fundamental part of our recreational lives. That being the case, and notwithstanding the uncertainty about how a post-COVID world is going to look, I can't help but feel optimistic for those of you who do want to invest your professional lives into television sport. There will be change, and there has been so much already, in terms of technology, production, broadcast style, methods of transmission, rights issues, and any other branch of the business you care to consider. What is possible now was unthinkable a quarter of a century ago. And no doubt what we experience now will feel old-fashioned and outmoded by the time some of you guys are channel directors and senior producers and rights negotiators, presenters, and the commentators of your age. So that has been a whistle-stop race, really, through history up to this point. But that, in a nutshell, is how we've got to where we are. And it only remains for me to wish you luck as you prepare to take it to the next level. Thanks, Paddy.
Thanks, Peter. That was brilliant.